Hi, welcome back to this week's lecture. We're going to be finishing up talking about later members of the genus Homo, except for, of course, ourselves, which we'll get into next week, anatomically modern Homo sapiens. But this week, we will be talking about Neandertals, pre-modern species of humans. So, for example, archaic Homo sapiens, we'll also be getting into, and some of the other more recently discovered fossils that complicate our understanding of things, that show more and more that human evolution was a more complicated process than we might have previously thought, that there were multiple species of hominins living at the same time, for example, but we will get into some of those, and I posted some articles about this for you as well. So what is the time frame that we're looking at here? In this case, the Middle Pleistocene, approximately, which the dates in your book are about different, from about 780,000 years ago to 125,000 years ago, but roughly that time range. Last week we talked about the early or lower Pleistocene, with, for example, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, some of those earlier species. This is where we are this week. We now know that Homo sapiens, some of the earliest, what we call anatomically modern Homo sapiens, so hominins that were essentially very much like us today, lived from about 300,000 years ago on, so that falls into that range here, as well as, so talk about, did a number of what might be other species, what might be members of one very variable species. Your book refers to this as archaic Homo sapiens, that, as we've talked about, lumpers and splitters, that covers a number of different kinds of hominins that were for sure closely related, but whether they were in fact different species, we're not really sure. There's a disagreement on that, but we'll go over some of those. So what was the world like at this point? As we've talked about before, when we talk about the Ice Age, what we're usually thinking of is the Pleistocene era, or Pleistocene epoch, this time period here. And this was not at a time when everything was uniformly cold and wet around the world, but rather a time of climate fluctuation. Alternating between what we call glaciations, these cold, dry climates that we think of when we think of the Ice Age, most likely, ice sheets covering most of the northern continents, and what's called interglacials. These are intervals that are warmer and wetter, where those glaciations are retreating. And so, as we have talked about, we are what we think we are adapted to is this variation itself, and our ancestors, of course, as well. So here is where we are. Of course, anatomically modern humans appear in the Pleistocene. Again, according to some more recent discoveries, this has been only in the past really few years or so, we have anatomically modern Homo sapiens fossils from as far as 300,000 years ago or so. And and we say anatomically modern humans, again, we mean hominins that were pretty much like us, at least physically, in terms of behavior, culture, cognitive capacities, etc. We don't know exactly, mostly because that doesn't fossilize, but anatomically, the species living at this time were pretty much like us. And as we can see, lots of climate fluctuation happening through this time, which was one of the things that hominins are adapted to. Specifically, particularly later hominins, anatomically modern humans and our more recent ancestors. When did Homo sapiens migrate around the world? We now know today, of course, that people live in all of these different places, and the reason that we're able to adapt to all those different places is because not only do we evolve biologically, you see this is a little bit outdated here, not only do we evolve biologically like any other species, but we also have cultural and technological adaptations to different climates. And that is something that is very characteristic of our species. We adapt through culture and technology as well as evolving like any other species. Neanderthals, on the other hand, had much more of a restricted range that they lived in. So these very cold areas here are what were at the time, and they are in fact adapted to that. So one difference between anatomically modern humans and Neanderthals was we are adapted to live in a number of different climates. Neanderthals, as we'll see with some of the features that they have, we think were kind of specialized for what was at this point a very cold weather climate. So these are all the major sites. We find them, and based on that, this is roughly where we think they ranged from. So, these are examples of different, what we call archaic Homo sapiens. These ones specifically are often assigned to a species called Homo heidelbergensis, but the archaic Homo sapiens encompasses these, as well as some other fossils that have sometimes been assigned to different Homo species. Again, lumpers and splitters. We know that this was a time when there was a lot of different hominins living around the world. We're not sure exactly which of them were the same species and which were different but closely related. I'll get into why that is. But yeah, these are some of these fossils as we found throughout much of the world here. If we look at these skulls, we can see these are not quite the same as anatomically modern humans, but they do look not too different from modern human skeletal features. We see brain size going up over time as well. We have got into, in the past few weeks, Australopithecines, earlier Homo species like Homo habilis and Homo erectus. We see, of course, the biggest jump in brain size from Homo habilis to Homo erectus. Archaic Homo sapiens brains are a bit larger, and here we are modern Homo sapiens. On average, our brains are about 1350 cubic centimeters. So that is a steady increase that we see over time, and again, that goes along with, we see advances in, for example, tool use is what we find in the archaeological record that gives us an idea of technology, culture, etc. at that time. Archaeological evidence for culture as well. Again, this is something that a lot of what was there probably didn't leave any archaeological evidence, but we do have stone tools. These are the Acheulean tools that we talked about last week that Homo erectus made. These are Levallois tools, or Mousterian tools, that we sometimes see in association with Neanderthals as well as other archaic Homo sapiens. Some people would, considering that Neanderthals could interbreed with anatomically modern humans, some people would consider those to be maybe not necessarily the same species, but within that, not completely biologically separate species, at least. And how these are made, the Acheulean tools were made by taking a rock and flaking parts off of both sides of it to create this kind of teardrop-shaped tool. Levallois tools, or Mousterian tools, were made by preparing the stone core that we would use to make stone tools, removing flakes from that, and in a lot of cases making different kinds of tools, having sort of a toolkit that was used not just one time, but over and over again for different things. So, more specialized tools, reflecting, again, different purposes, planning ahead for different use of tools. So, there is, wood doesn't tend to fossilize that often. We mostly find stone tools, which it is likely that there were other kinds of tools being used that we just don't have evidence for, but we do have some evidence of composite tools. This is one example of a approximately 400,000-year-old, what looks to be a composite tool, a tool that is made from the combination of stone and wood, and we do have evidence that Neanderthals did that as well. The book gets into this a little bit. One of the articles I posted gets into the fact that we've found the ancient equivalent of yarn or string that was made by Neanderthals, so that gives us an idea of some of the things that they were doing and making as well. Here are some reconstructions of Neanderthals. They look a lot like anatomically modern humans. Some clear differences, but they do start to look pretty similar to anatomically modern humans. And we know, in fact, that we were similar enough to them that we could reproduce, because some of us today have Neanderthal genes. Where and when did they live? Throughout what is now Europe and the Middle East, from about 130 to 28,000 years ago. This is the area that we find the fossils in. This is the kind of climate that they were adapted for, we think, is cold weather. So, the original fossil that was found, where Neanderthals got their name, Neander Valley, Tal means valley, and the name, it's the skull cap, some ribs, a pelvis, and some limb bones. And this is not exactly like an anatomically modern human skull, but has enough similarities that we know they were very closely related. And brain size, again, we have going from Australopithecus afarensis all the way up to modern Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals actually had, on average, slightly larger brains than anatomically modern humans. And we don't know why that is. It's possible that the different parts of their brain were expanding as your book gets into. Neanderthals' brains were larger in the back region than previous species. What's the occipital lobe? Whereas our brains are larger in the frontal lobe. This is why we have a very high forehead compared to these other species. Their large brains may also be adapted may also be an adaptation to the colder climates, because going along with body size adaptations, needing to metabolize things in a particular way. So, yeah, Neanderthals. We do have evidence that they were quite intelligent as well. So, and we'll get into some of those tool evidence as well. So, Neanderthal skull. A full view of one here. Obviously, this one's missing part of the back, but you can see kind of the shape of the Neanderthal skull, this lower, more rounded brain case, as compared to, I wish I had the fossils that we have on campus for replicas, but this will have to work for now. This Halloween mask, which is supposed to represent an anatomically modern human skull. More rounded skull, higher forehead, a chin, which Neanderthals did not have. So, some derived features that they had. These are traits that they don't share with anatomically modern humans. Larger brains that we talked about than even modern humans. what's called an occipital bun. It's this kind of bump on the back of the head. Neanderthals had larger faces than anatomically modern humans do. And their teeth, as you can see here, there is a space behind the third molar, which is something we don't have, which is why we often have to get our wisdom teeth or third molars removed. Neanderthals would not have had that because of this space. But very large front teeth. Their teeth were somewhat differently shaped than ours. And their cheek teeth, what we call our molars and premolars, were smaller. I skipped a slide. Let's go back. So, yeah, ancestral features. This kind of more sloping forehead that is not shared with anatomically modern humans. Lack of a chin. Neanderthals' chins would have been straight downward, whereas ours point outward. And these large brow ridges, again, anatomically modern humans don't have that to the extent that Neanderthals do. Facial adaptations were, we think, adaptations to cold weather, for example, for warming up air as they would breathe in, for example. We think this is where a lot of the Neanderthal features, skeletal features that we see came from. Here's again a comparison of Neanderthals and modern humans. In differently shaped teeth, skull, face shaped somewhat differently. This is a Neanderthal. This is a anatomically modern human skull. You see some of the similarities and differences there. In terms of postcranials, the rest of the body, Neanderthals were on average shorter, still kind of within the range of average for modern humans, but on average shorter than modern humans. Limbs, fingers, etc., also shorter, broader chests and pelvises, and we think this is also probably an adaptation to colder weather. Did Neanderthals have culture and language? Very good question. As for language, we don't have any concrete evidence one way or another. We know they had very large brains and were intelligent. We know that their hyoid bones, so here are, these are modern human, this is bone clones replicas. This is a Neanderthal hyoid bone, as we see pretty similar. And if you click on this, there is a video that demonstrates one theory as to what Neanderthals might have sounded like. Based on things like tool use, we know that Neanderthals made sort of toolkits. They had different kinds of tools that they would use at the same time. They have, we find with Neanderthal skeletons what appear to possibly be deliberate burials. We often find them in this kind of flexed position that this skeleton you can see is. And that is actually what is responsible for this stereotype of Neanderthals as being not walking fully upright, kind of being hunched over. There was one particular fossil that was found of an individual that had especially robust bones and probably evidence of things like arthritis, and was found in this kind of burial position. And so some of the scientists at the time assumed that Neanderthals did not walk fully upright, and we know that they in fact did. This is just how they're buried. We find in association with Neanderthal burials, what we think of is evidence that they were buried deliberately. In one case, we find what appears to be flower pollen. You know, today, in a lot of cases, what we do with burials, grave sites, is we put flowers on them. There's, it's not definitive. It may have just been that there were flower pollen that blew into the cave where it was found from somewhere, but that hasn't been disproven either. So they may have practiced deliberate symbolic burial. If we think of why we do those things today, honoring an individual, possibly belief in some sort of afterlife, We don't have definitive evidence one way or another, but it is possible that Neanderthals had all of that as well. We find some cases things like stone tools, animal bones buried with something we would associate with modern human burial practices. What did Neanderthals eat? Probably a lot more meat than anatomically modern humans did. They needed a lot more calories because of the way that they were built and adapted, and so that may have helped contribute to their extinction. Not being able to find that, but we know that they ate a lot of meat, and we also know that they hunted. Anatomically modern humans probably did more scavenging than hunting in terms of what Neanderthals did. So how do we know that they did a lot of hunting? So what we find in a lot of Neanderthal burials is, or in Neanderthal skeletons, is evidence of certain kinds of injuries. This is from an article on patterns of skeletal trauma, and it's comparing Neanderthal skeletons with those of modern rodeo athletes, people who spend a lot of time getting thrown off of horses. So, getting thrown off of animals. See this person happening here, and as the article states in a lot longer words, this suggests that they were spending a lot of time around large animals that were causing injury to them. Another aspect of this, we find not only skeletal trauma of certain kinds that suggests Neanderthals did a lot of hunting, but also we find evidence of healed injuries that someone would not have survived on their own. So this is evidence, again, not only that Neanderthals were hunting, but that they also had social structures such that they were able to take care of individuals who were unable to do that themselves. So because we have evidence that they recovered from these injuries. So what happened to all of these other hominin species? That is a very good question. As for Neanderthals, we know that they did share some DNA with us. We used to think that it was only outside Africa, but we've more recently found evidence that we do find Neanderthal genes within people in Africa as well. So probably evidence that there was a lot of movement happening, since we don't find Neanderthals themselves there. They were adapted for colder climates. But we know that there was interbreeding between Neanderthals and what eventually became anatomically modern humans, because some of us today have Neanderthal genes. And we know that there is we have fossil evidence of Neanderthals and one other population called Denisovans that share genes with modern humans. And we know, I believe if you watch the Carta talks that are linked to from the most recent symposium back in February, they get into the theory that there are at least 2 or so other groups of hominins that we don't have fossils for yet, but that exchange genes with modern humans, and we find genes from them in our populations today. So what happened to them other than that? We don't consider Neanderthals and Denisovans, etc., to be ancestral to modern humans, because while we share a little bit of DNA with them, most of our DNA came from archaic Homo sapiens. So, one possible theory is climate change. That as the climate warmed, the Neanderthals, who were very adapted to cold weather, may have died out or not been able to find food. There may have been decreases in fertility for some reason, we don't know, which could have caused them to go extinct eventually. Some sort of natural disaster, volcanic eruption, something like that. And could have been, of course, conflict with the ancestors of modern humans. We know that they shared DNA, but we don't have conclusive evidence one way or another as to whether, in general, their interactions were competitive or peaceful, etc. So anatomically modern humans may have been also somehow responsible for Neanderthal extinction. But yeah, again, those are theories. We don't really have good evidence for to support one of those over the other. There's evidence for different ones. So other later Homo species, these are ones that we know are not ancestral to us, and these are the ones that complicate the picture of human evolution. And we know that we're today the only member of the genus Homo living, but that was not always the case. We know that there were a number of hominin species around at different points in time. We know that so some of them were not ancestral to us. They died out. The timeline on which that happened, some of them had more traits that we associate with anatomically modern humans. Some of them had unique derived traits that they didn't share with either ancestors or anatomically modern humans. And yeah, there were just a number of different species around at this time, in addition to one highly variable either species or number of species that we refer to as archaic Homo sapiens. These ones are not archaic Homo sapiens. They're completely different. And most of these have been found pretty recently. Homo floresiensis, also known as hobbits. This is a reconstruction of one. This is a replica of a skull. These were found only in one very specific area. There's an island in what's now Indonesia where we find these skeletons, Flores Island, and that's where they get their name. And they get the nickname hobbits because they were very human-like. They were bipedal, but they were only about 3 feet tall and had somewhat different limb proportions than modern humans. Where did they come from? We really have no idea. They are definitely not a descendant of Homo sapiens. It was at one point thought that they might have been an example of sort of genetic drift or founder effect, a population of humans that had some unique adaptations, but we now know that is not the case. We also know that they're probably not descendants of Homo erectus. This article came out a few years ago. As we know, Homo erectus is the first hominin species that we know to have left Africa. These are found outside of Africa, so how did they get there? We're not really sure. That is something for future paleoanthropologists to hopefully figure out. Homo naledi, this one is the most recently discovered fossil. If you watch the Carta talks, I believe some of them get into Homo naledi as well. And there's an article posted in Canvas that talks about some of the difficulties with dating this species. So it's a hominin species that has adaptations that, based on what we thought was the picture of human evolution at the time, would have lived about 2 million years ago. A lot of ancestral traits, smaller brain, had some modern traits as well, bipedal with long legs like ours. And so when we found these, they were found, I believe, 2013, which is we've got here, in kind of a very out-of-the-way cave by some people who were exploring that. And there was a lot of difficulty involved in dating these fossils. They were in an out-of-the-way place. We don't think they lived in this cave. We don't know how the fossils got there, but there were hardly any other remains in association with them. So we know we can't often date a lot of these things directly because they're too old. So eventually, they did complete the dating on these fossils, and I believe that you can find, there's an entire journal issue that is devoted to talking about Homo naledi. I think the whole thing is open access, but you can read all about different anatomy. When they completed the dating, as you'll see in that article that's posted, they found something very surprising, which was that this species lived about 236,000 to 335,000 years ago, which would have meant that this species with, again, traits that suggest that it was more like some of the Homo species that lived about 2 million years ago, was in fact living at the same time as modern humans. Did they interact with modern humans at all? Did they share space or encounter one another? We don't know, but at least in terms of time, they do overlap. So what does this mean? Essentially that, again, the picture of human evolution is much more complicated than we might have thought. There were multiple species living at the same time. Some of them died out. One of them eventually led to us. We also interbred with some of these, not Homo naledi as far as we know, but with some closely related species like Neandertals. That's Homo naledi. Here is just a kind of diagram of some of the difficulties. As we've talked about with the fossil record, it's never complete. There's always things missing. Some areas have more fossils than others just because of the way that things fossilize. And so we don't really know, but a couple of different interpretations. We know that there were a lot of different hominins living in different regions of the world around this time. A lot of them fall under what we call archaic Homo sapiens, including Homo heidelbergensis, a number of others. Possibly Neanderthals within that as well, depending on how closely they were related. But we know that eventually that these led to what is now modern Homo sapiens, but how many species they were, etc., how closely related they were, we're not entirely sure, and these are differences in classification. Do we have this one category of all of these different archaic Homo sapiens, or do we have, for example, Homo heidelbergensis, the other species designations that have been talked about, in addition to the species that we know were not closely related to us, like Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis. So, if you are interested in this, there are a number of different studies that have come out very recently. This is a very active area of research, and we're always finding things that cause us to change our picture of what hominin evolution looked like. And the conclusion for now, lack of a conclusion really, is that it was far more complicated than what we might have assumed before, which was just one species evolving directly into us and nothing else. We're finding all these other fossils now that lived around the same time. So that is, I believe, all for today, and I will talk to you next week.